There is an airport in the middle of Spain that looks as if it was built for a future that never arrived. The runway is more than 4 kilometers long enough, according to multiple reports, to handle some of the largest passenger aircraft ever built. The terminal was marketed for millions of passengers. The project was often described as a billion-euro airport, and yet near the end of its first life, it was down to just 4 flights a week. In one reported year before the collapse, it handled only about 55,000 passengers. That is not the traffic of a new international gateway. That is the traffic of a mistake with jet bridges. This was Ciudad Real International Airport, also known as Don Quixote Airport, a private airport built south of Madrid with an enormous promise. It would create a new aviation and logistics hub in central Spain. It would relieve pressure from Madrid. It would connect to high-speed rail. It would bring passengers, cargo, jobs, and development to a region that wanted a place on the aviation map. But within a few years, the airport was insolvent. Regular airlines disappeared. Operations shut down in 2012. The terminal became a symbol of Spain's construction boom, banking crisis, and overbuilt infrastructure. Then came the global headline that made the story almost unbelievable. An airport once described in the press as costing roughly €1 billion received an infamous bid of just €10,000. That was not the final sale, but it captured the scale of the collapse. Eventually, the airport was sold for €56.2 million and later reopened under a completely different model. So the real question is not simply why Spain built a ghost airport. The deeper question is how a project with a huge runway, political support, private ambition, banking money, and a convincing development story could fail so completely as a passenger airport. The answer is not one bad decision. It is a chain. Demand forecasts that were far too optimistic, a location that sounded strategic on a map but was weak for real passengers, a high-speed rail link that never reached the terminal, a financial crisis that hit Spain at exactly the wrong moment, regional savings banks with dangerous exposure to property and infrastructure, a business model that seemed better at getting built than at generating sustainable traffic, and finally, a forced sale that revealed what the market thought the airport was really worth. To understand how it happened, you have to go back to the moment when Ciudad Real did not look like a failure. It looked like a vision. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Spain was in the middle of an infrastructure age. New roads, new rail lines, new urban developments, new airports, new terminals. The country was modernizing quickly, and in many places, construction itself became a form of optimism. If a region wanted growth, it built for growth. If it wanted relevance, it built something that could signal relevance. And in aviation, few symbols are more powerful than an international airport. Ciudad Real is in Castilla-La Mancha, south of Madrid. Depending on the reference point, the airport sits roughly 160 to 200 kilometers from the Spanish capital. That distance is important because the project's story depended on a delicate idea. Close enough to Madrid to be part of the capital's aviation orbit, but far enough away to offer space, lower congestion, and a new platform for passengers and cargo. In some descriptions, it was promoted almost like a southern alternative to Madrid, not Madrid itself, but connected to Madrid's economic gravity. On paper, this could sound plausible. Madrid Barajas was a major hub. Spain was growing, air travel was expanding across Europe. Low-cost carriers were reshaping demand, cargo and logistics were becoming more important, and high-speed rail promised to shrink distances that had once seemed too large. If Ciudad Real could connect air, rail, and road in one place, then maybe it could become more than a regional airport. Maybe it could become a new kind of inland aviation platform. That was the dream. A private international airport with a very long runway, a large terminal concept, room for cargo, and a story of regional transformation. But aviation does not reward dreams just because they are big. Airports are not successful because their buildings are large. They are successful because enough people and airlines have a reason to use them again and again. This is the first hidden weakness in the Ciudad Real story. The project was built around future demand, not proven demand. It was not expanding an overwhelmed local airport with passengers already waiting at the doors. It was trying to create a market, and creating a market is much harder than serving one. For an airport, demand is not just a number in a forecast. It is behavior. Will people drive there? Will airlines base aircraft there? Will passengers choose it over a larger hub? Will cargo operators gain enough savings to offset the inconvenience? Will tour operators and business travelers build habits around it? Will the connections be frequent enough to make the airport useful? Every one of those questions matters. And if too many of the answers are weak, the terminal can be beautiful and the runway can be enormous, but the airport still fails. Ciudad Real's runway became one of its most dramatic symbols. Reports describe it as about 4.1 to 4.2 kilometers long. That is an extraordinary piece of infrastructure for a place that would later struggle to fill even a small schedule of regular flights. A runway that long can suggest confidence. It says, "We are ready for big aircraft, long haul operations, cargo, maybe even the Airbus A380." But it can also reveal the problem. The airport was built with the scale of a hub before it had the traffic of one. A giant runway does not create passengers. A terminal does not create airlines. Capacity is only valuable if somebody wants to buy it. Otherwise, it becomes empty space that must still be maintained, financed, secured, staffed, insured, and eventually explained to creditors. The project's geography made that challenge even harder. Ciudad Real was not in Madrid. It was south of Madrid, far enough away that a traveler choosing between Madrid Barajas and Ciudad Real would have to ask a simple question. Why would I go there? Madrid Barajas already had the network, the airlines, the connections, and the habits. It was the established hub. If you were a passenger in the Madrid region, Barajas was where the flights were. That is the network effect of a major airport. The more airlines use it, the more useful it becomes. The more passengers use it, the more airlines want to be there. A new airport outside that circle has to offer something powerful enough to break the pattern. Ciudad Real's answer was supposed to be access. The airport would not just be a distant runway. It would be connected. Most importantly, it was linked in the public imagination to Spain's AV high-speed rail system. If the airport could be tied directly to fast rail, then the distance to Madrid might feel smaller. The story could change from remote airport to connected multimodal hub. But the rail connection did not arrive as promised. A structure for a future station or connection became one of the most haunting images of the airport, a walkway toward passengers who never came. The terminal had the language of connection, but not the connection itself. And without that high-speed rail link into the terminal, Ciudad Real remained what geography said it was, a long way from the main market it hoped to serve. This is one of the clearest lessons in the case. Infrastructure projects often depend on other infrastructure. An airport can be designed around a rail station, a highway interchange, a cargo zone, a city expansion, or a future industrial cluster. But if one key piece is missing, the entire business case can weaken. The airport is not just the runway, it is the system around the runway. Ciudad Real had the runway, it did not have the full system. Even then, the airport did operate. It was not a place where no aircraft ever landed. That is one of the easy myths of ghost airports, and it is not accurate here. Airlines did come. Names such as Air Berlin, Ryanair, Vueling, and Air Nostrum appear in accounts of the airport's short passenger life. Ryanair opened a route to London Stansted in 2010 and later canceled it. Vueling became the final important scheduled operator. There were real flights, real passengers, real attempts to make the airport work. But real does not mean sustainable. By October 2011, reporting from Al Pays described a brutal mismatch. Only about 55,000 passengers in the previous year, against a facility marketed or discussed in terms of millions of passengers annually, with some reports referring to capacity of up to 10 million. In the final period, there were just 4 weekly flights. Think about that ratio. A project associated with a €1 billion scale, a 4-kilometer runway, and international ambition was functioning with the traffic of a very small regional airfield. That is not just underperformance. That is a business model collapsing under its own assumptions. For airlines, the decision is unforgiving. They do not keep flying to an airport because the terminal is new. They fly where the route economics work. If the aircraft leaves with too many empty seats, the route burns money. If ground operations are inconvenient, if connecting demand is weak, if marketing support cannot compensate for poor load factors, airlines leave. And when airlines leave, the airport becomes even less attractive to the next airline. This is the downward spiral of a weak airport. Low traffic makes the airport less useful. Being less useful reduces airline interest. Less airline interest reduces frequencies. Fewer passengers make the routes weaker. Eventually, the airport is not failing because one route failed. It is failing because the network never formed. Ciudad Real reached that point quickly. Vueling's departure in late October 2011 was a symbolic blow because it removed the remaining scheduled lifeline. After that, the idea of a passenger hub was no longer just struggling. It was essentially gone. But to understand why the collapse was so severe, you have to look beyond the empty seats. The airport was born into a financial environment that made big construction projects seem easier to finance than they really were. And at the center of that environment were Spain's cajas. Cajas were regional savings banks, often deeply connected to local politics, local development, and regional business networks. During Spain's boom years, many cajas became heavily exposed to real estate and infrastructure. They were not just neutral lenders looking at spreadsheets from a distance. In many regions, they were part of the development machine. They could finance projects that promised jobs, prestige, and growth. But when the property bubble burst and the financial crisis hit, that model became extremely dangerous. Ciudad Real's airport was widely described as a private project. That matters. It was not simply a national government airport built directly by Madrid as a normal public airport program. But private does not mean isolated from public risk. Reporting connected the airport to regional savings banks, including Caja Castilla-La Mancha, which had major exposure to the project and was itself hit during Spain's financial crisis. El País reported direct and indirect involvement by Cajas and described the project as private but entangled with institutions that had political and public sector dimensions. The BBC also reported on the role of savings banks and the debate over how private the risk really was. This is where the airport becomes more than an aviation story. It becomes a story about incentives. During a boom, everyone can point to the upside. Politicians see jobs and visibility. Builders see contracts. Banks see loans and regional development. Promoters see a landmark. Local leaders see prestige. The hard question is quieter. After the opening ceremony, who pays if the passengers do not come? According to BBC reporting, a bankruptcy report suggested that the loans help cover the construction phase, but not enough of the investment needed to make the airport function as a sustainable operating business. That distinction is crucial. Building an airport and running an airport are not the same problem. Building is a project. It has contracts, milestones, concrete, asphalt, steel, and invoices. Running is a market. It has airlines, passengers, cargo customers, marketing, route development, maintenance, security, utilities, staff, and debt service. A project can be completed while the business remains broken. Ciudad Real showed exactly that. The physical airport existed. The commercial airport did not. That question matters because an airport has two different lives. The first life is the life of the construction project. That is the part that can be photographed before the first profitable route exists. Concrete can be poured, asphalt can be laid, a terminal can be opened, a ribbon can be cut. The second life is the commercial life. That is the part that has to survive every week with actual aircraft, actual customers, actual operating costs, and actual revenue. The first life can be successful even when the second life is already in danger. Nurse Ciudad Real exposed the gap between those two lives. The airport could be completed as a physical object. It could have a runway, a terminal, aprons, roads, parking areas, and the technical identity of an international airport. But none of that automatically created the pattern of repeated use that makes an airport valuable. In aviation, the asset is not only the infrastructure, the asset is the flow of people, aircraft, cargo, and money through that infrastructure. Without flow, the building becomes a cost center. And this is where the role of the Cajas becomes so important. The airport was described as private, but it existed inside a regional financial system where private ambition, local politics, and banking exposure could overlap. Caja Castilla-La Mancha, one of the institutions connected to the project and reporting, became one of the symbols of Spain's troubled savings bank sector. When a bank like that is tied to regional development, lending can become more than a pure calculation of risk and return. It can become part of a political economy. Support the project, support the region, support the construction cycle, support the promise of jobs. That does not mean every participant had the same motive, and it does not require claiming a single proven conspiracy. The safer and more useful point is structural. When the rewards of building are immediate and the proof of demand comes later, the system can become biased toward construction. The contracts happen now. The press releases happen now. The employment claims happen now. The hard evidence arrives only after the airport opens, when it is too late to unbuild the runway. And for a normal business, a bad forecast can be corrected before too much capital is spent. A store can open smaller. A factory can delay expansion. An airline can lease fewer aircraft, but a new airport is a massive, irreversible bet. Once the runway is built, the debt and maintenance remain. You cannot shrink a 4-kilometer runway into a cheap experiment. You cannot turn a nearly empty terminal into profit just by hoping next season will be better. Scale, once financed, becomes obligation. Then the timing turned catastrophic. The airport opened or began operating in the late 2000s, with sources differing between official opening in 2008 and operations around 2009. That placed it directly in the shadow of the global financial crisis and Spain's own severe economic downturn. Credit tightened, property values collapsed, regional banks came under pressure, public finances strained, consumers and businesses changed behavior, and the optimistic world in which the airport had been imagined disappeared. Even a well-located airport would have struggled in that environment. A weakly located, underused, debt-heavy airport with an incomplete access promise was in far worse shape. The crisis did not create every flaw in Ciudad Real's plan. The demand problem, the geography problem, and the missing rail link were already there, but the crisis removed the margin for error. In boom times, weak assumptions can be hidden by cheap credit, political patience, and the belief that tomorrow will be bigger than today. In a crisis, those assumptions are exposed. This is why the airport's collapse should not be explained as simply bad luck. Bad luck is when a good plan is hit by conditions nobody could reasonably survive. Ciudad Real's problem was harsher than that. It needed too many favorable assumptions to come true at the same time. It needed passengers to accept the distance. It needed airlines to believe the demand would grow. It needed rail connectivity to make the location work. It needed banks to keep supporting the project. It needed Spain's growth story to continue. And it needed all of this before the debt and operating costs overwhelmed the business. By 2011, the exposure was impossible to ignore. The airport had too few passengers, too few flights, too much debt, and too little time. Reports described debts in the hundreds of millions of euros. Some accounts spoke of more than 300 million euros. Later reporting around the administration and sales cited figures as high as roughly 529 million euros, depending on scope and timing. The exact numbers vary, but the direction does not. The airport's financial structure was far too heavy for the traffic it generated. In April 2012, operations were shut down after insolvency and receivership. The airport that had promised to transform a region became one of Spain's most visible white elephants. The phrase white elephant is overused, but here it fits. A white elephant is not just something expensive. It is something expensive that is difficult to maintain, hard to use profitably, and politically embarrassing to abandon. Ciudad Real had all three. The runway was there, the terminal was there, the control tower was there, the access roads and empty spaces were there. But the economic reason for all of it had failed. And then the story became surreal. After the shutdown, the airport entered a long process of liquidation and attempted sale. Courts and administrators had to deal with an asset that was enormous, specialized, and deeply distressed. An airport is not like an apartment block or a truck fleet. You cannot easily sell it to any buyer. The buyer must be able to operate or repurpose a regulated aviation facility, invest in maintenance, convince authorities, and find a business model. That narrows the field dramatically. It also changes the meaning of value. To the original promoters, the airport could be valued by what it cost to build, by what it might become, or by the regional transformation it was supposed to trigger. To a distressed buyer, the value is different. It is based on future usable cash flows, the cost of reactivation, regulatory obligations, maintenance needs, and the risk that the original passenger model will never work. The same runway can be worth one number in a dream and a completely different number in insolvency. In 2013, liquidation steps moved forward. The sale process began with much higher expectations. But as time passed, the market revealed how little confidence there was in the original passenger airport dream. The reserve prices fell. The gap between claimed construction cost and market value became the story. Then in 2015, an offer of 10,000 euros from a Chinese-led group to Zanin International made headlines around the world. It sounded impossible, a billion-euro airport for the price of a used car. But this is where factual caution matters. That 10,000 euro figure was an offer, not the final sale of the entire airport. It became famous because it was shocking and because it perfectly symbolized the collapse in perceived value. But it was not the final legal outcome. The final reported sale came in 2016, when CR International Airport SL acquired the airport for 56.2 million euros. That is still a dramatic fall from the billion-euro descriptions, and even from lower construction estimates reported elsewhere. It also shows how badly the original business case had been marked down. The market was not paying for a thriving passenger hub. It was paying for distressed infrastructure with uncertain future uses. That sale is one of the most revealing parts of the story. When an airport is being planned, forecasts can be optimistic, presentations can be elegant, political speeches can be confident, but when the same airport is sold out of insolvency, the buyer's price is a harder kind of truth. It says what someone is willing to pay after the dream has been tested. In Ciudad Real's case, that truth was painful. Still, the airport's story did not end a simple abandonment. That matters, because the easy version of the story is that Spain built an airport and it died forever. The reality is more interesting. Ciudad Real failed as the passenger gateway it was supposed to become, but the physical asset still had potential for other aviation uses. In 2019, the airport reopened activity under new ownership and a different model. Instead of chasing a large schedule of regular passenger flights, the new strategy focused on uses such as general aviation, maintenance, repair, and overhaul possibilities, storage, cargo, and industrial aviation activity. Local reporting described more than 150 flight operations in the first 3 months after reopening, mostly not the kind of mass passenger traffic imagined at the beginning. During the pandemic era, the airport also became useful for aircraft parking and storage, a role that many large open aviation sites suddenly needed. This reopening did not prove the original plan was right. It proved almost the opposite. The airport could have value when the model was narrowed to fit the asset: lots of space, a long runway, fewer passenger service expectations, and activities that do not require millions of people to choose Ciudad Real over Madrid. Aircraft storage does not need a dense schedule of departures. Maintenance and industrial aviation do not need the same passenger network effect. Cargo can sometimes tolerate different geography if costs, space, and operations make sense. Those uses are not glamorous in the same way a major international passenger hub is glamorous, but they can be more realistic. That is the difference between a failed mega project and a repurposed asset. The mega project was the story sold at the beginning. The repurposed asset is what remained after the market stripped away the fantasy. This epilogue is important because it changes the lesson. Ciudad Real was not useless land. It was not incapable of aviation activity. The runway was real, the facilities were real, the space was real. The failure was the mismatch between the infrastructure that was built and the market it expected to serve. It was designed and sold as something much larger than what demand could support. Later, it found a more modest life by becoming something closer to what its location and assets could actually justify. That is the uncomfortable truth behind many ghost airports. The problem is not always that nothing can be done with them. The problem is that they were financed and promoted as if the most ambitious version of the future was already guaranteed. In Ciudad Real, each piece of the chain made the next failure more likely. First, the demand story was too big. The airport was marketed around millions of passengers, but the actual market was tiny. Second, the location was too weak for the passenger role. It was close enough to borrow Madrid's name in the imagination, but too far away to compete naturally with Madrid Barajas. Third, the missing high-speed rail connection removed the one piece that might have made the geography feel less damaging. Fourth, the financial structure depended on a boom-era ecosystem of savings banks, construction, and regional optimism that collapsed under the Spanish crisis. Fifth, once airlines left, the airport lost the network effect it desperately needed. And finally, the insolvency sale proved that physical scale is not the same as economic value. The most tempting way to tell this story is as a joke: a huge airport, empty halls, a €1 billion label, a €10,000 bid. It almost writes itself. But the real story is more serious than the punchline. Ciudad Real was a warning about how infrastructure can fail when planning starts with the desired monument instead of the proven market. In aviation, this mistake is especially dangerous because airports are systems of dependency. An airline needs passengers, passengers need routes. Routes need frequency. Frequency needs demand. Demand needs access. Access needs geography and connections. Financing needs revenue. Revenue needs all of the above. If one part is weak, the others can sometimes compensate. If several parts are weak at once, the entire airport becomes a machine designed to lose money. Ciudad Real had ambition, but not enough gravity. It had runway length, but not enough routes. It had terminal capacity, but not enough passengers. It had political and financial momentum, but not enough operational reality. It had a promise of connectivity, but not the rail link that could make the promise believable. It opened into a crisis, then discovered that crisis does not forgive optimistic math. That is why the airport became a ghost airport, not because Spain did not know how to build. Spain built it, not because aircraft could not land. They could. Not because every person involved was chasing the same bad motive. The record is more complicated than that. It became a ghost airport because the physical project raced ahead of the economic proof. The final irony is that Ciudad Real may work best when it stops pretending to be the airport it was originally sold as. As a passenger hub, it was a failure. As an aviation industrial site, a storage field, a maintenance platform, or a cargo-focused facility, it may have a more realistic future. That does not erase the collapse, it explains it. A runway can survive a bad forecast, a terminal can be reopened, a failed airport can be repurposed. But the money spent on a fantasy version of demand is much harder to recover, and that is the lesson of Spain's billion-euro ghost airport. In aviation, scale is not strategy, capacity is not demand. A runway in the right presentation can look like progress, but a runway